Hello and welcome to another edition of Coffee with ... I'm Ben Roden, forgot to say that. Also, I keep on smirking every time I begin this because I have a clapperboard at the beginning, which strikes me as ridiculous every time I do it.
I was very impressed by it. I thought, wow, we're in the big time now.
Yeah. It belongs to my daughter's like filmmaking game from like that she has had for the last 10 years. And I just like every time I do it, it makes me laugh. And then the first thing that anybody sees is me saying, "Hi, I'm Ben Roden," with a stupid grin on my face. But that's okay because I normally have a stupid grin on my face anyway. So yes, so it's Coffee with ... And today's ... is or are Craig Whelan and Reza Shah. So first of all, can I begin by asking, I'd have to direct the questions to one or other of you at the time, yeah? So first of all, your job post, the name of your job, and the responsibilities, duties, that kind of thing. Beginning with you, Craig, for example.
English teacher, pure and simple. I don't teach children, I teach adults at the Valencia Center here in Spain.
Okay.
Mainly advanced and exam preparation classes.
Right, okay. Sounds very similar to me, except for the Valencia part. And Reza?
Exactly the same as Craig, except I would add that I also do young learner classes. So
Do you?
a bit of both. But
Do you have do you have a favorite level or age? I mean, do you prefer young learners, adults?
I don't like because I don't think I'm very good at very young learners. So I'm probably not the best person for the job. But for older teenagers, I think quite often they can be more disciplined and more productive than adults for higher levels.
Yeah,
Actually.
I have found that myself. Yeah, they're very used to, you throw work at them, they do it. They're very used to the system. Yeah. And Craig, have you ever taught a young person's group, like very young, or?
I was teaching overseas, not in Spain, and I was offered a job. A teacher went out on pregnancy leave and put me for 6 months in a young learner class.
Right.
And it was a nightmare. I dreaded going in the morning. I don't have kids myself.
Right.
My sister doesn't have kids either. I don't feel particularly comfortable around kids. So after that experience, I decided that I wouldn't step in the classroom with young learners again. I had to on a couple of occasions in Valencia through pure necessity. So yeah, I mean, I got through it, but no, it's not for me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think. Yeah. I know what you mean. Obviously, I think the best thing you can do as a teacher is play to your strengths, and the students recognise that. And so I think it's like if that's what you feel more comfortable with. Obviously, there are joys at every level, of different types. So yeah. Okay. Right. Well, so it's generally experienced English teachers based in Valencia, right? And so how did you become? I mean, you mentioned just now, Craig, that you worked in other places. How did you become the position you're in now, British Council Valencia? What was your journey? Did you always have you always been a teacher? Did you do your TEFL when you were like 22 or something?
I did my TEFL, yeah, when I was fairly young, but I ended up in teaching in an Arab Jewish community center in Israel, and in Tel Aviv, and there was a British Council school there, very close to where I lived. And at the time, I was teaching at the Arab Jewish Community Center and also for Berlitz. And I applied to the British Council in Tel Aviv, and I wasn't accepted. And that kind of stayed with me.
Right.
And years later, I ended up in Spain, applied to the British Council here, and they accepted me. So the story had a happy ending.
Yeah.
But I've been working at the British Council since '97.
Wow.
In here, so that's over 20 years now.
It is over 20 years. It's actually, I don't want to depress you, it's well over 20 years.
Thank you, Ben.
It's okay, don't worry.
It's cheered me up on this lovely Friday morning.
It's pretty much a quarter of a century, but let's just leave it. So Reza, what about you? Similar story? Did you go to Tel Aviv? Did you
Not Tel Aviv, but not far from Tel Aviv. I've been around a few places in my youth. First of all, I did a TEFL course years ago at the University of Ulster, because I just finished my degree and I thought, well, what will I do? I thought I'd quite like to see a bit of the world and yet have a job at the same time. How can you do that? I thought TEFL,
right.
Get a job and stay somewhere exciting. So I did a TEFL course, and the first job I got was actually in Turkey, so fairly near Israel.
Yeah.
But it didn't last very long because to be honest, the guy who owned the private school where I worked, I think he was a bit of a mafioso or something. He had
Uh-huh.
like a minder. I'm not joking. He had a heavy who looked after him, so I didn't want to hang around there.
No.
And then I ended up in Spain via Berlin, strangely enough, because a couple of German friends came to visit me in Turkey, and I said, you know what, I'm going with you. I'm leaving this place, and I went to Berlin, and then from there ended up in Spain. I was in Cáceres in Extremadura,
Uh-huh.
first of all, then Salamanca for a
Hmm.
couple of years. And then in 1998, so just a year after Craig, I ended up in Valencia and got a job at the British Council straight away. Just one class, I think, and then I worked at private academies and doing a bit of private one-to-one teaching as well. And so I can't say I've worked at the British Council quite 20 years because I actually buggered off for a while in the middle. 2010, I took leave because
Like a
I happened to get
sabbatical.
offered a job. Yeah, sabbatical, yeah, kind of extended leave, I guess. I got offered a job in Belfast at Queen's University.
Right.
Coincide that with I fancied getting back home, and my dad was a bit ill at the same time. I thought, I haven't seen him in a while. It'd be good to spend some time. So it worked out really great. I was able to be with my parents for about 3.5 years, and then came back to the British Council. So
Lovely.
I'm a bit less than 20 years.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, far, far, far less than 20 years. No, it's Craig who's been here for the incredibly long time. Yeah, yeah. I applied to Queen's University to study French when I was on my Uckel's form. That was one of my first choices. I think mainly because I just wanted to be able to say to my friends at Christmas, "Oh yeah, I study in Belfast. Yeah, it's there's nothing to do with the course, which was an excellent course. They didn't accept me anyway. Anyway, so. Right. So why are we all gathered here today? It's because you two have a podcast, which I've read. We've recently read about this in various communications. Aprender inglés con Reza y Craig, or probably people call you Reza y Craig.
Exactly.
I've actually looked
and
for
many other things too. Yeah.
I've looked for it on the internet, and I can only find it's called Inglés Podcast. Yeah. Without any accent. So it could be Inglés podcast or English podcast, depending on, so we may get some people looking for something completely different.
Yeah.
The project started in 2014. So can you tell me, why did you decide to run a podcast? And just tell me basically about the structure of the podcast. Why did you run it? Why did you decide to run it? Craig?
Well, I've had a website with a good friend of mine, Luis, who's a Spanish friend who lives here in Valencia. And we started a website called mansioningles.com back in 2001.
Sorry, what was the name?
Mansioningles.com,
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
La
Okay,
Mansión del Inglés.
Yeah.
So we started that, and obviously I was writing material for it, and Luis was the webmaster. So eventually you need to put audio on the website,
right?
Which in those days was an MP3 embed in the HTML. And then I started to get interested in podcasting. So around about 2006, 2007, when podcasting was taking off, I thought, well, I could make a podcast based on a newsletter we were sending out monthly.
Right, okay.
So I was basically reading this newsletter verbatim, which was incredibly boring, incredibly dull. I was putting myself to sleep. God knows what it was doing to the students. But it was a podcast. So the podcast birth really goes back to then, and we still get a few downloads from that. But every time I listen, I cringe.
Yeah.
And then at some point, Reza's it's always been a good friend. We've basically been teaching together at the council since 98. And I said to Reza, do you fancy coming on as a co-host? And as soon as Reza came on to the podcast and we started doing it together, that's when it really took off. I think it's the dynamic of us two doing the podcast together that makes it listenable.
Do you find that you have a kind of role that you take on? When I was working with a friend on a radio show here in Madrid, I found the roles were kind of basically just, as you can imagine, me talking all the time and him trying to get a word in. But do you have roles that you find that you have like certain strengths that you play to?
That's an interesting question. What do you think, Reza?
I don't think we have designated roles as such, but we have kind of things that we're into more. For example, I unashamedly admit I love a bit of grammar.
Right.
love a bit of grammar, and I love tricky grammar questions. That really hits the spot for me. So I'm only too happy to answer complicated
Absolutely.
grammar questions.
No, I
This is,
understand that. When they say, why do you say this? You think, oh, excellent question. Why do we say that? Like, and you analyze it. And Craig, you're not so much on the
I must admit,
tickety-snickies.
I do. When there's a tricky grammar question that comes in, I'll introduce it and say, "Okay, Reza, over to you. Take it away."
Brilliant.
But
Okay.
yeah, that's true. Reza and also Reza's Spanish is better than mine. And we were told early on that we were using a lot of Spanish in the podcast, so we really brought that down.
Right.
And we're very strict on how much Spanish we use, and sometimes we'll translate a word or an expression for
Yeah.
time purposes. But I tend to pass that over to Reza, or at least check with him on the podcast that I'm saying it correctly,
Right.
because his Spanish is better than mine. So I defer to him with grammar and Spanish, basically.
Well, I did notice on the podcast that you use Spanish, which I think is absolutely a tool which sometimes in the podcast, not necessarily in the classroom, even in the classroom perhaps, is very useful and a little bit dismissed by a lot of people. But if you, for example, one example on your show, one of your shows, you said, I think it was one of the listeners telephoned in and said something about make the most of something. And you said, this is aprovechar. And now the number of times that a Spanish person will say, how do you say aprovechar in English? And you'll sort of say, well, we don't have a translation. We have ways of expressing it, but they include this. And you end up saying, take advantage of. And then it's wrong in so many situations. So it's very useful. I think it's useful for students to hear that, think, okay, right, all right, I'll add that to my list of possible translations of aprovechar. Instead of sort of saying, well, it's when you, and spending 10 minutes explaining it. If you want to say something like sprocket, it's better to just use the Spanish word instead of sort of saying, well, it's whatever a sprocket is. That was a really bad example.
Rhyming it for half an hour,
yeah, exactly.
and they still don't get it. But we were
exactly.
told very early on, someone wrote in or sent in a voice message and said, when you speak a lot of Spanish, it takes us out of the English mindset.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we stopped doing that.
That's curious. Okay, that's very useful. That's useful advice, I think. Yeah. So, do you have a fixed structure? I mentioned people phoning in. What's the kind of the format, Reza?
Well, we always begin with the introduction, who we are, and what the theme or the functions or the main areas are going to be, and then we like to start straight into feedback.
Right.
That's really important for us. Feedback is possibly the most important aspect of the whole podcast, I'd say. I mean, we don't like the idea that we're kind of teaching in a bubble and we don't know if anybody's liking it or listening to it or
Right.
not. So we straight into feedback, and we prefer if we can get people to record their own voice and send audio feedback, and we'll play it.
Yeah.
If they've no objection. Or some people write us an email. We'll play that, and some people even leave a comment on the webpage. So we like to start off with feedback. Sometimes it's unrelated, but sometimes there's some kind of connection between the feedback, and we might then turn that into the theme of the lesson.
Okay, and so so you mentioned a website there as well. So where can we find your podcast? First of all, I should have asked that earlier.
Well, you mentioned it a couple of times. Thanks for the plug. Inglespodcast.com is the URL. That's the website.
Right.
But the name of the podcast is Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig. So anyone searching on their podcast app of choice would either search for, well, the best way to search is Inglés Podcast.
Right.
That will come up.
Yeah, it's good that name was free, because it's a good name. It's easy. It says everything in a very short space.
Yeah, that's exactly why you went for it, Craig, isn't it?
Well, I went for Podcast Inglés.
Right. Okay.
But it wasn't available. So Inglés Podcast was the next.
That might be because there's a guy called Les who calls himself Podcasting Les, and therefore it was already taken.
Yeah, it's a Les who's podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And has it grown? Has it changed? I mean, for example, in numbers or scope or range of what you cover? Primarily in numbers, are you growing? I mean, I'm assuming you are. And does the format change as you grow?
Yeah, we have grown exponentially since 2014. We've been going up. It's kind of hit a plateau, and we're kind of wrestling with the way to move those numbers up. But as far as format's concerned, one thing I think is worth mentioning. In the beginning, Reza and I tended to think of the themes and the focus of the podcast, whether that were grammar, vocabulary area, whatever. But very quickly, the themes came from the audience. So we'd get feedback. Can you explain this? Can you talk about that? So as far back as I can remember now, the focus of every episode comes from the listener. So we know that at least one person is getting something useful. But the numbers have gone. I mean, I think you've got the numbers. We spoke about this recently, Reza.
Yeah, as Craig said earlier, the original listeners were people who were already fans of the Mansion Inglés website, and they kind of came over. So it started off about 200, thereabouts, grew and grew and grew. Now, per episode, we're getting about 13,500. So
this is on one episode. That's measured on one episode release over a 30-day period. So if one comes out on the 1st of January, you measure it on the 1st of February. And then, of course, because it's evergreen content, you get the long tail effect where people will go back and listen to your back catalogue, which boosts the overall downloads up.
Okay.
And this is always close to.
One statistic that Craig told me the other day, it was news for me. It kind of blew my mind. If you were to add up all the downloads we've had since we've started, all the episodes, it's getting on for 10 million. 10 million. Yeah,
that's fantastic.
That's what I thought. Wow,
that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yes, that's incredible. Yeah. And Craig, you were going to say it's approaching something. You were going to say
that was the figure I was going to give.
Okay.
Which surprised me when I saw it too. I thought, wow, and that's mostly because if you have a news podcast, obviously after a week it's obsolete.
Right.
But if you're podcasting about grammar and vocabulary that doesn't have a sell-by date, they'll go back and listen to anything they're interested in.
Right, exactly. It has a fashion date. That is to say that presenting an idea in one particular way may go out of fashion in language teaching, and they say, oh no, we don't talk like that anymore, we do it like this. But in the end of the day, the content is the content, and the grammar is the grammar, the vocab is the vocab. Yeah. And this is all downloads, right? You can't listen to this live.
It's pre-recorded. It isn't live, and it's through an RSS feed, which is the way podcasts are distributed. So it's on Spotify and Google Podcasts and iTunes and the usual,
so
usual suspects.
All right. So there's not a radio version that goes out on the radio at such as
no.
Okay. Right. So
can I just point out, Ben?
Sure.
As Craig says, it's live, but it's semi-scripted. Let's say. So obviously we decide in advance the themes or the grammar, the vocab, whatever, the pronunciation area we're going to look at. And we kind of vaguely script a bit, but probably not the exact words we're going to say.
No. But
maybe a few examples and stuff. But I would say it's about, what would you say, Craig, about 50-50 spontaneous and scripted, but a mixture,
Yeah, we follow the bullet points, but we riff on some things and try and personalize it. So the balance we're trying to get is between giving information that's useful to the listener, giving them value, and also personalizing it so that they'll come back to listen to us. Okay. So there's that balance of trying to entertain and educate at the same time.
This is the same as a lesson plan, if you think about it, isn't it? I mean, you have a certain kernel of information that you really want to get across, and you give yourself pointers and timings and stuff like that. But you know that when you actually go in there, you're going to improvise and mess about and go in different directions. But at the end of the day, you've got that kernel. You have to have a script of some sort.
But I would argue more difficult than a lesson plan, because with the lesson plan, if you're teaching live, you've got the feedback directly from, like a stand-up comic would have from the classroom, so you can adapt your material as you go. And depending on the needs of the students in the classroom. With the podcast, you're not getting immediate feedback.
No, it's what a lot of stand-up comics are saying now about doing Zoom gigs, that they're without an audience, every joke falls flat, apparently. Even if people are laughing in their houses, you don't hear them. So there is that as well. You're talking to an empty space until you see the numbers of 10 million. You think, okay, people were listening, but
someone's out there. This is on. It's working.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Also, one person has downloaded it 10 million times, like some mad obsessive.
That's me.
So teachers and students are benefiting from podcasts. First of all, how can teachers use podcasts in the class? Your podcast, for example. Reza, do you want to take that one?
Well, we like to think that we cover quite a lot of things.
Hmm.
So you name it, there's probably a theme or a grammar point or a vocabulary point that you're interested in that we cover in the podcast. And why not use it in class?
Hmm.
It's listening. It's not from a textbook. It's a podcast. But what difference
How
does
long is each podcast in
you
minutes?
can treat it as if it was, an MP3 from a book. It has the same purpose as far as we're concerned.
Okay.
Perhaps not the whole podcast, but selected extracts.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, so how long would a podcast last? I mean, you couldn't do the whole thing in one class. I guess are they 20 minutes each, or?
Oh, that's a good question actually, because that has changed over the years. I think they used to be a bit longer, partly because I just kept waffling on and on and on. There was no way of stopping me. But we realized that the sweet spot, a nice kind of number was about 30 to 35
Right.
minutes, maybe
Okay.
40. If you go over that, we find it's beginning to drag on a bit.
Okay. And can we find a list of the contents on your webpage so that a teacher who sort of says, I'd love to just send them home, say, listen to this podcast about the gerund and the infinitive or whatever it is, they can find a list of content on the webpage that might
Not a
coincide?
list as such, but there is a search box. So if you search
Right.
gerund infinitives, you'll get a list of all the episodes that have gerund infinitives in the title.
Okay. All
So
right.
the title reflects what the content is in most cases.
Okay.
But there's one thing I'd like to add to what Reza said. Back in I can't remember if it was September, October last year, the British Council put on an online teachers conference, and I spoke on podcasting inside and outside the classroom. So there's a quite an in-depth dive into how to use podcasts on the British Council Spain website.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, what was it? Where would you search for that? How would we find that?
You'd see it if you go to British Council Spain on
Right.
YouTube.
Okay.
It's the presentations there. And I basically, just quickly in a minute or two, it's basically based on three separate studies. The first study I did was for self-access outside the classroom to improve listening skills for exam purposes. So I used my class as a model, and I looked at, I divided the class into two, and there were students who did extra homework and they listened to podcasts, and I compared the results at the end and proved that podcast listening will get them a better listening mark in exam.
Brilliant.
The second one was comparing video to audio, seeing what's the best use of the students' time. Should they be watching Netflix in English, or should they be listening to podcasts in English? So I won't tell you the result of that. You have to go and watch the video. But there's statistics, and that was across the British Council in Valencia. So that included C1 and B2 level students in the study. That was larger. The third one, perhaps more to your question, is student-centered podcasting in the classroom, which I did last year based on the My Class material we were using in the Valencia Center. And instead of just doing the final task in the material of My Class, it was a podcast that was then published out in the world. So the students recorded on their mobile phones, that podcast went out there, and they could actually listen to their work. So that was practicing pronunciation, that was practicing collaboration, the scripting of it, the re-recording.
Did you sort of script an introduction for them where they sort of say, hi, we're doing this exercise, we're doing this task? Or did you just basically hang the podcast as the task, recording of the task? Or was there
just the recording of the task, because each task in the My Class system is different.
Yes.
So sometimes it was interview based, sometimes it was a short monologue, sometimes it was student presentation, and it was at C1 level. And that was quite successful. In fact, when the lockdown hit and we couldn't have in-person face-to-face classes, we did the final podcast with Zoom. We just recorded the Zoom with the students in the class online.
Wow. Okay.
And that was published, and that kind of finished the study. But anyway, I won't
it's
bang
fine.
on about that. That's all in the video. It's a fairly long, detailed video explaining those three. Stephen
will drop a visual in so that people can find that, I'm sure. So just look on Stephen's information that he'll be dropping in now, or probably has done already. Okay, so good. And so the future then, let's say 10 years from now, 2030, what's the podcast landscape like in terms of English teaching, or English teaching, ELT landscape in terms of podcasts? Or do you think they'll become more prominent? Do you think people be doing them as a part of as a normal thing in the class? What do you think? Do you think the role of podcasts in the future, say 10 years from now? Reza, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they'll be used more in the class and outside the class, both actually. I think there'll be less and less need for specific um, recordings related to textbooks. There'll probably be links, I think, that send you to podcasts.
Okay. Yeah.
There may be
yeah.
some specifically recorded material, but I reckon they'll be integrated into courses. And outside the classroom, I think people will be listening, above all, to practice things that interest them. Like if they like football, they'll be listening to football podcasts more. I'm talking about
like
non-native speakers.
Premier Skills, for example, the British Council
Exactly.
podcast.
The British Council one, which is very good.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think that the idea that in the future, it's happening more and more already, the idea that you send your students out, you say, okay, your homework is to go out and listen to this, watch this, come back. So the idea of not having to block sections of your lesson off for a 20-minute listening or a 20-minute video, you just say, your homework is not to write tonight, your homework is to go and watch this or listen to this. And I think that probably will happen more and more. And those who don't listen, who find their 20 minutes doing something else, will come back into the class unable to participate fully. And you learn really quickly then that what you have to do is do a bit of that listening to boost your powers of listening. That's really great. It's very interesting. I was going to ask you a lot of other questions, but I'm afraid we sort of run out of time, really. Yeah, I know.
It went quickly.
Yeah, really quickly. Yeah, what's your favorite podcast that you listen to for fun? You're not allowed to say English or a podcast or Premier Skills or The Selector, which is another British Council podcast. So your own, do you have one that you always listen to?
Well, Ben, by the way, I hate listening to our podcast because of my voice. I can't stand it. My voice is horrible. I hate it. Really, it drives me mad.
Yeah,
Greg's voice I like, but my voice, ugh.
I think everybody feels like that. Yeah, you've got a great voice. You sound good on the radio, Reza. Believe me, you both sound really good. So
I know that you listen to Andy Zaltzman, Ben.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Do you know his sister?
Yes.
She has a very good podcast that I love called The Illusionist with an A, The Illusionist. And that's really good for language teachers to listen to because it deals with language and she's very, very good.
She's I've forgotten her first name. She's Ms. Saltzman, but I can't remember her first name.
You've stumped me.
Anyway, the Illusionist, an excellent analysis of specific words or reasons why we use idioms. Very, very enjoyable.
Helen
Zaltzman. Yeah, Helen Zaltzman. Very enjoyable. What about you, Reza? Do you have a favorite one that you?
Well, Andy Zaltzman rings a bell, doesn't he? He does the news quiz.
He does now, yes, and he does the Bugle, an excellent satire podcast.
Yeah, I'm quite a capricious podcast listener. I'm not very regular. The only few that I fairly regularly listen to are comedy, ancient things like the news quiz, the Now Show, things that started off on radio many years ago.
Yeah.
I like them. Just a Minute, ancient things, which still work. For me, they still work. And as
absolutely. Sorry, I haven't a clue.
I love all those things.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Yeah. And yes, and I would the only one I would disagree with is the Now Show, which somebody describes a curate's egg, which is a phrase that means that I think it's a curate's egg where everything is bad. So I'm not sure. But the people involved are very talented. That's true. But the scripts are dire, in my opinion. It's just an opinion. Anyways, that's great. Thanks so much, Craig and Reza. This has gone really quickly. I wish we could have. We'll have to do another one in a few months. Okay.
Pleasure.
Part 2. Yeah. So cheers. Thanks very much indeed. I hope this is all recorded. Otherwise, we'll start
Thanks
again.
a lot, Ben.
All right. Thanks very much, Craig. Thanks very much, Reza.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.